Hello and welcome to Nerdarchy. For nerds, by nerds, I'm Nerdarchy Dave, and tonight I'm joined by this fine nerd.
And I'm Nerdarchy Ted, and tonight we're waking the oldest, most powerful forces in fantasy, dragons.
When dragons awaken, the world trembles. Whether it's prophecy, politics, or pure destruction, there's no going back.
We're diving into how these iconic monsters shape worlds, shake up campaigns, and steal the spotlight.
So sharpen your wits, gather your horde, and let's roll initiative on When Dragons Awaken.
All right, folks, before we dive fang first into Dragonfire, here's how tonight's chat is going to be structured.
Breaking it down across three of our signature worlds, each one facing a very different kind of draconic awakening.
First up is Aether Skies. What happens when a godlike dragon stirs in the highborn clouds and the Sky Guild scramble to keep control?
Then we go deep into Under the Dome, where an ancient sonic worm stirs beneath the ruins, warping minds and rewriting fate.
And finally, Zoo Mafia. Yep, even in crime-ridden animal underworld, dragons have a role. And when one moves in, everybody pays tribute or pays the price. After that, we'll open up the floor for Q&A. Got thoughts on dragons in your world? Tips for running one in a game? Drop those questions in the chat and we'll tackle as many as we can.
With that, let's light the first fuse and soar into Aether Skies.
So what's your favorite dragon moment? Could be from a game you ran, a story you read, or even a movie. Was it all inspiring, terrifying, or totally off the rails?
Aether Skies is the dark arcana punk world of floating cities powered by unstable ether, suspended above a cursed monster-infested surface with Cold War paranoia, secret factions, and the return of a vanished city heralding eldritch horrors. Survival depends on wit, will, and navigating the lies told in the clouds. Links to our first ever Aether Skies game, as well as our 5e D&D game, is in the description below.
So when dragons awaken in Aether Skies, they disrupt the delicate balance of power, threatening both city-states and ether-based technology with their ancient reality-warping presence. Their return signals a deeper unraveling, perhaps tied to the lost gods or the secrets buried within the 13th city, forcing factions to either weaponize or worship them.
Dragons are ancient ether-reactive beings whose presence can destabilize struts and magic alike, making them both a catastrophic I can talk and stuff, making them a catastrophic threat and a source of immense power. So, we have not really seen or witnessed dragons in Aether Skies yet, but we do know the first age of Zantara, the world of Aether Skies, was your stereotypical fantasy world. We don't go into great detail on the specifics of what it was like before, because we're kind of in like a third age at this point. After everyone's fled the surface world, it's become very much more industrial and arcana punkish. It is like the second age, and the third age is when these eldritch horrors begin arriving after the city of Haven is destroyed and it returns, right? And that's where we've been playing and adventuring. But that doesn't mean that dragons don't exist or couldn't exist.
All right, so let me ask this question first. When you ran Aether Skies for D&D in a castle, did you use dragons in that campaign at all?
I did not.
You did not. So that's something that I feel is a lost opportunity. A dragon fight from atop a skyship could be a lot of fun to play with, and leading up into this topic, I was thinking like, all right, first and foremost, where would I start off? Because it's far easier to build off of a monster that already exists. Um, so I know what I would answer, but where would you start building from one of the established dragons that exist in the fifth edition monster? Oh, not monster, but in the fifth edition dragons that we have so far.
Okay, so are you asking what dragon would be the first dragon that I would try and import from D&D
So
into this world?
So if you were going to build a dragon for Aether Skies,
Hmm.
like what stat block would you start off with to build on top of to make a unique dragon for this world.
So I probably wouldn't look at any of the like traditional metallic or chromatic dragons. I would probably look at
Hmm.
something like a solar dragon or a void dragon, which is not
Okay.
from D&D but Cobalt Brass. Something like that. Like so now I will say, I guess my earlier statement that dragons have not been in other skies isn't actually accurate
Okay.
because um Robin's character in our first campaign was in
Hiss.
had Hiss, which was, you know, kind of like a shadow dragon that took up residence on her persons, right? Dr. Lucy, she kind of like tamed this corrupted presence and almost wore it like a tattoo.
Hmm.
But when Dr. Lucy lost control, Hiss would come out and then Hiss would grow in, early on, like maybe the size, of a dog, a horse, to eventually the size of a full dragon where, you know, Dark Bunny and Dr. Lucy rode Hiss away, into, wherever, right? You guys don't even know what happened to them. So, so there was a dragon and it very much was not one of your standard typical dragons. It would closest resemble like a shadow dragon or one of the shadow dragon um
So
templates.
So the reason I ask is because I was thinking about this one specifically for Ether Skies. Beings, it is so eldritch horror. My thought pattern was to start off conceptually, just looking at the stat block, not at the lore, but I was looking at uh, the Elder Brain Dragon. It's combining the presence of this, this incredibly powerful magicy being into everything that is also dragon. So I thought that would be where I would start if I was going to be building something to terrify my players.
Yeah, so there's different ways you could go, right? Like there could be slumbering dragons on the surface world, right? Maybe they're active, maybe they're not. It could be that whatever drove the gods away from the world is the same thing that, sent the dragons into their slumber. So you could have them awaken, or the players discover them on the surface world, and maybe they're, the ones that actually are the catalyst for awakening dragons in Zantara.
Mm.
That was
I
definitely
am
one of my thoughts.
as you're well aware, about to run a campaign that is primarily leading characters down to the surface. So it is entirely possible that you guys might stumble into something and, awaken some kind of dragon or some kind of thing. So that's something to think about and make me wonder.
So, what do you think is another way that dragons could affect the world other than physically being in it?
So, some factions, including radical cults or rogue ethermancers, seek to bind or bargain with dragons, seeing them as the keys to forbidden knowledge or dominion over rival cities.
And that's definitely a thing I could see happening if a dragon were to awaken. Definitely, Ethermancers are going to definitely be very interested because dragons are beings of, the world, and when I say the world, I mean like they're actually made up of the elements of the world, right? Literally as well as figuratively. And they're creatures of magic, right? They're always depicted
Yep.
that way. And in Other Skies, Ether is magic, right? So like Ethermancers are gonna be like, oh, what's going on here? This thing is just forcing with magic and want to do something with it, you know, and that's not even getting into the fact that some of the different factions are going to also want to uh be involved with them, Knights of the Anti-Ether, I could definitely see them being very, like Saint George like, and being want to be the Dragon Slayers,
Sure.
in their nightly
So
role.
you could literally have dragons that absorb ether and are, entirely looking to, you know, be a catalyst against the magic of the world. And you could have dragons that, are all about ether, that are comprised of ether. Both of those things could induce organizations or cults. It could very much, split down into, subclasses or organizations that are all about that specific dragon, let alone conceptually, to be able to, dictate and guide a path for an individual character or story.
Or imagine an Ether Ficer that wants to power their devices with a dragon from the Ether from a dragon.
Hmm.
Could you just imagine, like, the different directions that Tara or Bunny's mind would go in if they encounter this being that is so the Ether is so integral to its makeup, and what they would try and do with it.
Could you imagine a dragon that has like a pure ether uh breath weapon, and like could spellcasters, be like, all right, well, I'm gonna avoid the damage by like over channeling and absorb it as opposed to taking it, and then, see what what ramifications that winds up having. I think that could be, from a mechanical perspective, that could be really awesome component to play with.
Yeah, and also like the idea that dragons themselves absorb ether, right? So using it against them might be very difficult, right? It's because they're soaking it up like a battery.
I mean, there is I mean, we technically have already built that kind of component with our Spell Eater Barbarian. You
Hmm.
would just have to like ramp that up to, dragon standards.
Excellent. Combining barbarians with dragons. What what could possibly go
Well, I'm
wrong?
talking about a specific, you know, a specific use power. But sure, barbarian dragons, I'm here for that too.
Absolutely. So, Awakening of Dragons may be linked to the return of the 13th city, hinting at a deeper conspiracy involving the collapse of the Divine Order and the return of Eldritch forces. So, conceptually, like, this age is the age where maybe dragons do begin returning. Maybe they're in the world already, and depending on how you view dragons, right? Like, in this world, are dragons shapeshifters? You know, could they possibly be among us? Maybe dragons have always been among us, and actually, most of the leaders of the Eternati are just shapeshifted dragons.
That is a fun aspect. And I know this is slightly off topic, but like we did a video a while ago about true sight, and how, oh, once characters get high enough that they've got access to true sight and they cast it in town, that's when you mix in, oh, random people, commoners to, you know people in power aren't what you think they are, and you unlock all of these, other potential subplots of, angels, demons, dragons, and, eldritch entities that are there interacting on a regular day-to-day basis. You can do so much fun with it. So to take that concept of putting a dragon who, sure, it might spend 10, 20 years in a human or an elf form to go in and mingle to learn. Maybe it's there for a specific quest. And when you have thousands of years of existence, what's the say, that they're not willing to spend 20 years to investigate a specific incidents, or to learn a specific piece of information. It could be trivial, but for whatever reason, this dragon chose to do it. You could have a lot of fun exploring those kinds of concepts. Um, but yeah, so I would love the idea of dragons having, intermingled into, you know mortal politics, just to see how how things tick.
That I like that idea too, and it's kind of interesting that like there are dragons among us, but no, for the most part, no one knows. Maybe other dragons know, and now that we're in this third age, maybe this is the thing that'll start bringing them out, whether by
Hmm.
choice or not. Because as we have these creatures that are from this Cthulhian dimension, maybe they are able to pierce the guise of the dragons, and in more ways than one, not just identify them, but actually force them to take their true forms.
So that
Imagine
that
what would happen if the ruler of one of the 13 cities gets exposed as actually being a dragon.
right. But that leads me to a thought pattern of like, there is so many different ways to view dragons. When you look at D&D, it's freaking right in the name, Dungeons and Dragons. You know, Dragons are not the most powerful thing in D&D, but so you've got the ability to turn the dial of how powerful are these. So we could very well, have this axiom of, is this world kind of conceptually dragons versus these eldritch entities? And you could have it so that, you know the dragons, literally, most of them have been put to sleep to create the barrier to keep the eldritch entities out. And as the barrier is weakening, dragons, could be stirring from their slumber. All but a few of them have been, dormant, lying in their, caves in the sky or in the ground, in the mountains, wherever they've been, cast off to. Heck, there could literally be a dragon, asleep in one of the floating chunks of cities that is in just a deep cave that nobody knows about. Like they could be anywhere you really wanted them to be. Um,
Like
but I love this concept of the dragons and these eldritch horrors, being opposites. That doesn't necessarily stop them from being at odds with, the mortals, but it adds another dynamic of, well, what happens, you know, if the players do come against one of these dragons and it tips the odds, by they kill the dragon. Now there's less resistance on that barrier. Now the eldritch entities, can allow more through.
I love that idea. The idea that they were put to sleep and that they're kind of fueling the seals. Because it also leads to other fun questions, right? Like, was it was it willing on their part? Did they do it voluntarily, or was it done to them, right? Because depending is going to have very different outcomes, right?
So
If you start getting some that are awakening,
sure. So
then
like if the question were to ask to me, I would say some were willing and some weren't. Whether it be, an immensely powerful ritual that was done, that blood was gathered, or scales were gathered, or whatever. Some way that it was set to being done. Maybe it was a combination of the gods enacting the magic to use against the dragons and the eldritch entities. The gods disappeared knowing that they were losing their power. um the dragons paid the price to protect the mortals. Barrier created, dragons are asleep. Gods are gone, but the mortals are protected. There's no vast threat to them now. And then, slowly throughout the ages, gods haven't come back, dragons begin to awaken, barrier gets weaker. There's lots of fun potential to play with that.
so there were two other thoughts I had. One is, what if the reason they can't recreate the flying cities anymore is because the other cores for the flying cities are each a dragon
Hmm.
that is literally powering the city and keeping it aloft, and the other is introducing dragons as things from the place where eldritch things come from.
Oh,
Um, so there, and also you could do a combination of like you could literally do all three of those things probably.
right, right, right.
And then, and then which leads to a very interesting question of Haven, the 13th city, that was technically fell, returned, was corrupted, got purified. What state is if you're going with dragons or the other cores of the cities, what state is that other core, that dragon in right now?
So I imagine that dragon, probably is in a state that like it's in flux. Like perhaps like sure it got corrupted, but maybe the corruption of the city was basically funneled down to the dragon. So maybe you've got this dual personality dragon that wants to be good, but at the same time, half of its body has become this eldritch entity that is literally all of the evil energy, all this eldritch energy, instead of it being blasted out and gone, got funneled down to the core, going into this dragon. And, now is this unique monstrosity that is, in essence, at war with itself.
Yeah. And like the citizens, even the supposed experts don't know what's going on with the other cores because it's one of those things. It's worked a long time. We just don't touch it because we don't want it to stop working, and we don't want to accidentally mess it up, right?
Because
So they
when
don't
that
know that.
stops,
Yeah.
it falls.
Well, and also, so that means, well, what happens if one of the dragons stops wanting to be the core, right? Or it has the ability to break free. I mean, I think these are all fun, interesting ideas we can introduce into Other Skies and play with and experiment. And hey, maybe you're not playing Other Skies or an Arcana Punk world. I still think you can use this as inspiration to say, well, what are different ways I can use dragons in my world? How can they interact? And are they always been there, or do they need? Are they being awakened? And I kind of like that idea in the sense that like the players and their characters kind of get to discover what dragons are in your world, you know, as the same time as they're coming into.
Slowly. So if a dragon rose from the ether storms tonight, would you flee, fight, or try to forge a pact? Tell us how your character or you would handle the return of these sky-shaking titans.
All right, we're gonna jump into our next segment. Under the dome, beneath protective crystal domes, scattered city-states cling to order amid a world of warped by chaos, magic, and mutated monstrosities. Life inside is a volatile mix of rigid hierarchy, survivalist ingenuity, and simmering rebellion, where power is hoarded and truth is carefully curated commodity. You can check the description for links to nerdarchy.com, where Nerdarchist Ted is creating weekly articles over on the website.
So in Under the Dome, the awakening of dragons, literal or symbolic, signals a cataclysmic shift, unleashing buried chaos, forbidden power, or revolutionary change. Which ancient beasts or rising rebels, their stirs threaten to upend the fragile order beneath the crystal domes?
Catalysts of chaos and change. Dragons, whether mythic beasts or powerful individuals, represent forces that disrupt the stagnant order beneath the domes, awakening buried truths or chaos magic.
So, when you look at, the concept of dragons in a post-apocalyptic setting, where we've got chaos magic and what have you, I view anytime you've got a unique element to a world, it's like my automatic instinct is, well, is there a dragon of that?
Yes.
You've got, mithril dragons and platinum dragons and gold dragons and silver dragons. So to me, is there a chaos dragon or a chaos storm dragon? Is that something that exists that literally, rides the storm clouds, bringing, these elements of reality shaping magic? Are they drawn to these storms, or are they creating them? Do these things exist in purely elemental, type situations that they never touch ground? They don't have the typical horde that you know regular dragons have. They exist, purely in the skies. I mean, that's that is thoughts that my mind trickles out to when I begin thinking about Under the Dome.
Well, hear me out, Ted. They do have a horde. Their horde is a bigger and bigger storm that they
Mm.
travel with, where it travels with them. Who knows? I very much like the idea of having the what came first, the chicken or the egg kind of question, when it comes to
Uh-huh.
dragons and chaos storms. And our dragons the harbingers of chaos storms because they actually bring them where they go, or because they go where they are. And that these particular chaos dragons have an uncanny sense of detecting them or finding them, if it is indeed the fact that they're creating them. And I love it when you can kind of have like unanswered questions like that, so you can let the players mull it over and throw it back and forth and let them decide what they think, right? And sometimes it's fun to just not answer the question.
Absolutely. I mean, that is the greatest element of you know world building is suspense. You can't just like ask a question and get an immediate answer. Having time to let that build and to work towards discovery, like that's so much more rewarding. When players spend 2, 3, 4 sessions, working towards an end, like they're like, I finally, oh my God, that's awesome. I finally got here. I finally learned the answer to the question, rather than be like, oh, after the game is over, it's like, oh yeah, that's this. Oh, that's anticlimactic.
So Ted has a Todd McFarlane Joker dragon he's dying to use, right? And I love the idea of the fact that that was a chaos dragon that somehow got captured or taken over by the Carnival of Chaos.
Mhm.
And like so that's why its appearance is like that of a freakish clown dragon. That's not what typical chaos dragons look like. It might be a close facsimile, but that has been greatly altered or corrupted by the carnival, uh, in its own way.
Yeah,
And
if you go to nerdarchy.com, you'll see a cool article about the Joker Dragon. I actually think I did 2 articles on it. One talking about the dragon, statting it out, and one kind of making a Joker Dragon's lair. Um, so you can definitely have a lot of fun with it, and you don't necessarily need the Carnival of Chaos to you know play with this thing. And it's available on Amazon for significantly cheaper than what a lot of other minis go for, and it comes with a base, perfectly plopped in for your typical battle grid. Um, so as soon as I saw it at work, I'm like, I have to have this.
you seen it at work.
Yeah,
I do that a lot too. I just see things. But anyway, we're also playing with the idea of a dream realm that is a transient realm, like the Shadowfell or the ethereal plane or the
Stay wild.
Feywild, right? And we've been tweaking it a little bit, and I just introduced it as a concept in our game that we've been running. Even though the players have technically been there before and more than once and have encountered it, but now it's been kind of thrown out there to the characters as a place that they could possibly visit and use to travel other places, within the world of Volcania, and almost like like the ways in Dresden, or any other thing mythical thing where, also I believe there's the ways in Wheel of Time as well, right? So this idea of basically shortcuts around the world but going through this place, which may or may not be the safest place to travel through. And it's something I want to get into more and more, because one, I just love the concept of transient planes that overlap each other. And we haven't done a ton with dreams and dream worlds, so I feel like in the in Under the Dome seems like a fun place to experiment with it, especially because it is so much different than your typical fantasy world. Because it has those elements of post-apocalyptic. But I feel like, well, that place also probably has its own versions of dragons as well. Where I feel like the corrupted Chaos Dragon isn't really from there, but was brought there and changed. Where there are other ones that would be from there and would be very different from that.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a lot of different directions that you can go. But we also look at threats to dome stability. The literal awakening of a dragon could destabilize the delicate energy balance protecting the domes, endangering entire cities and revealing the limits of grind barons or other dome leaders' control.
Yeah, so like in our own campaign, you know, for the most part, most monsters really aren't a threat to the dome itself because the domes are so powerful. With the exception of you guys, where you guys found the Titan Stone, which awakened a Titan who wanted it, who was put to sleep using it, and you're like, well, we could out try and outpace this thing and run away, but if we go back to the city, we actually think this thing may be one of the things that can break the barrier, and that will just be bad. And in
So
that sense, dragons could be similar.
yeah, I look at that element and it's like first off, that Titan could absolutely destroy a dome as tall as it was. Sure, the domes are hundreds of miles across, and we've speculated at what exactly it takes to to make the dome. Um, but when you look at what dragons can do, like even if you take your basic ancient dragon, they're pretty freaking badass. Do we have ye old basic dragons in this world, or is each one kind of a unique creation? This is built on the framework of Volcania, where like typically dragons have not been ye old basic. So after such an apocalypse, or many apocalypses, depending upon what actually brought it from its typical fantasy world into where we have now, like what what would that do to those dragons? Would it reshape them? Would it structure them into something entirely different? Or are dragons so powerful that their natures would remain the same?
So I also had the thought of very much like when we were talking about gods and religion and spirituality, which is a different video you can find on the channel. We had discussed the idea. Well, what if the domes were actually powered by the gods? Like the gods, are actually were sacrificed in order to enact the domes. Just as we talked about an Ether core being an actual dragon, you could do the same thing in our other setting, other skies. But you could do the same thing in Under the Dome with the dragons, the most powerful of dragons being used to power a dome, and whether it's imprisoned, whether it's sleeping, whatever, what happens if it gets freed? What happens if it awakens? Right? Does it reclaim its power, thus ending the dome? So that would be a catastrophe unto itself. And like I kind of like the idea that maybe some of the domes are powered differently. Like maybe they're all powered differently. Like
Mhm.
this one's powered by a sacrificed god. This one is powered by five slumbering dragons, right? And you know they've been slumbering for eons. Maybe the chaos of the world has been slowly seeping into them, changing them, as time goes by. So what do they become? What awakens? And what happens to to that particular dome? Maybe there's a dome where like you came up with one is ruled and controlled by something that is a giant but greater than a giant. Well, what if that same thing in another dome is a dragon? And if you go back into kind of the lore of Oathganya, we did the stereotypical thing of you have different ages. This is the age of mages, the age of dragons, the age of giants, whatever. And conceptually, the idea was the gods would try different things in the world. And when it didn't work out, they would just shove it into a pocket dimension. And that's also one of the reasons why in our fantasy Oathganya world, our typical fantasy world, there isn't a lot of dragons because they all got shunted off into their own dimensions, these own little demi-planes, and kind of trapped there. And the concept behind Oathganya and why the chaos storms were happening even in our typical fantasy world, albeit on a smaller scale, is because every time the gods did this, they started like weakening the barrier between the plane of chaos and the plane that Oathganya exists on. And to a certain extent, under the dome, this campaign setting is when too many of those barriers have been weakened and shattered, and they're no longer able to hold back the chaos storm or the chaos magic, which manifests into these storms, and now they kind of run rampant upon the world. So, we could take that lore and kind of incorporate it into what we're doing with Under the Dome now. And some of those things, like we did a Clockwork Kingdom. We had the Vargarians. We had the different dragon realms that were incursions, and I feel like there might have been several. Oh, there was the Goblin King world where we kind of did a world of goblins, but more like fey goblins. And there might even be more than that. I'm not thinking off of the top of my head. Well, we could use those to kind of influence how dragons affect the world too. Like, what if for each one of those there was also a dragon that was in the world? Going with your thoughts on like the dragons here are probably each unique. They're not your stereotypical dragon from your monster manual.
Yeah, and that to me is a lot more fun because like sure, it's more work on the DM to figure out, what is the lore, what does this stat block look like if I'm gonna make a dragon encounter. But to me, like that's kind of what I want as a veteran gamer. I've fought all kinds of dragons. I've encountered them, as players. I've run them as DMs, and it's to me a little less exciting to be like, oh, the dragon scales are white. Okay, well, I'm not using cold. I know I have to worry about this, that, the other thing. This dragon's stupid. Um, you know, whereas like you drop a dragon on the table, you describe an encounter that doesn't necessarily have to give the players any information. Sure, you describe a dragon as like comprised of lava. All right. I think it's safe to say I'm not using fire on it. But like when I dropped a spider dragon on you guys, none of you thought, oh, well, I already know not to use this or not to use that. You just are like, what the hell is this nonsense?
Not even. We're like
And
gross because the breath weapon
well,
was
there's that
gross.
too. And I loved that encounter. I loved from start to finish, conceptually making it to actually running it. Um, and sure it was gross, but all the players had a lot of fun in that encounter because it was something unique. It was something different.
Maybe there's still a spider dragon around.
That is entirely possible. And WizKids put out a spider dragon. While it's cool, it's not how I envisioned a spider dragon looking. And it certainly wasn't as big as the one that I used, but was what it was.
What are you gonna do? So, symbols of rebellion and power in a world built on suppression and secrets, an awakened dragon embodies the rise of uncontrollable power, be it personal transformation, revolutionary spirit, ancient forces long thought dead.
So, anytime you've got a post-apocalyptic setting, there is always some, underlying or overlying current of rebellion. There's somebody in power that is abusing that power and, using it for, their own ends, their own gains. Where, the lowly people barely make it through. So you've got that 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 current, that possible avenue of gameplay, be it things happening in the background, or like that is the main story beat throughout the whole campaign. And dragons have, for good or for evil, they're always a symbol of power. They're always a symbol that people look up to, because they're generally viewed as the pinnacle of where you can get to. So sure, you can slap that on a breastplate or on a banner and rally people to your cause. Even if you're not legitimately a dragon, it's used in organizations, as it's used in symbology. So sure, let's wave the banner of the dragon and let's go.
Unless the dragon actually waves its own banner and
Well, there's
begins
that too.
begins gathering its own forces. And also, and like and that is the idea too, that if a dragon shows up in this world, and any world really, it represents to the powers that be a power that they can't control, and that they might have to deal with. Now, it could be malevolent, but it doesn't have to be. But in a world like ours, the powers that be tend to be more on the malevolent side than the benevolent side anyway. So for this common citizens in Oath Canyon, under the dome settings, living in a dome, like they may not really see much of a difference between a fire breathing monster and the monsters that sit upon the thrones that rule over their day-to-day lives.
And that's the great part about the different domes that we have already established. We've got grind barons in Crystallia. We've got a fairly corruptible magocracy in Valeria. We've got a uh, very evil, uh, essentially a giant titan, or giant Etten, whatever you want to call him, in Titanholm. And beyond those three, we haven't really done a lot of establishment, but I'm
Well,
trying to build out a few more options, just to kind of explore a little bit of what this setting looks like and feels like, taking some of the information that we've kind of talked about, here, and using that as inspiration. Um, so like I look at, as Dave said earlier, of like, oh, we've got all of these civilizations that kind of existed in demiplanes, and like that could technically shape a dragon, but could also shape a city to go along with it. So like when you look at these fey goblins, what would a fey goblin dragon look like? What would that city look like that's been inspired or powered by such a creature? um I my mind is a whirl of different things that I want to create and do with with these concepts, as like we come up with these, and some of these things, like we start off with the ideas, and it's seeing where the ideas bend and twist as we start talking. So it's a lot of fun.
yeah. So early on, like I introduced the concept that there are a couple other cities that Crystallia trades with. And
Right.
then last session, I believe, is when I introduced Celestia, the City of Gold.
Hmm.
Um, you know, which is a mystery to you guys because you're like, never heard of that. What is that? And also, the ruler, and from what you guys have learned so far, there's a single ruler, and the person your character is terrified of that ruler.
So I don't know if that is a good thing, or if uh, you know, or if Vex is you know not evil enough for this guy. Like is he on par with Valar Twosold? Or is he like the good counterpart? Do we have I gotta imagine in a vast world there's gotta be some domes that are led by good people, even if they're just struggling to get by and what have you. They can't all be, you know, dark sun, evil masochist rulers, right?
Maybe only time will tell, Ted. Only time will tell.
All right. So if a dragon stirred beneath your feet, an ancient power long buried, would you fear its fire or follow its call? Consider, what would you do if the world built to protect you was never meant to survive the dragon's return?
All right. Finally, last but not least, we go into our final segment, and you may be wondering how we're going to talk about dragons in Zoo Mafia. In Zoo Mafia, you're a criminal animal living in 1920s style zoo where organized crime runs wild after dark. By day, you play the part of a regular exhibit. By night, you and your mob pull off daring heists, dodge rival families, and scheme to get made without letting the humans catch on. Links to the upcoming Kickstarter and free quick start rules are down in the description below.
So in Zoo Mafia, when dragons awaken, symbolizes the rise of powerful forces like a crime family asserting dominance or a once silent mob making a bold move that shake the balance of power. These awakenings can ignite turf wars, expose secrets, and force every player in the zoo to pick a side or get burned.
So, Komodo and frilled dragons, the muscle and the messenger. Komodo is the long dormant muscle of the zoo underworld awakened to reclaim lost turf with brute force, while frilled dragons, their flashy frill flaring informants, fan the flames by spreading whispers and coded warnings of the coming storm.
All right,
So,
so All right. So before we dive further into this, I did a little bit of, pre-planning on, Komodo dragons for Zoo Mafia. So I've got a character, whether it be, insert him in as a cool PC that I'll do at some point in time, or he's ready to step in as another mob boss. But I've got Marco Malto Salamandra, the Komodo dragon. And I believe I sent you like, a piece of artwork that, I figured out that I thought, just looked absolutely badass of this guy in the cool suit with the hat and the cane. Uh,
you absolutely did. So, the idea in Zoo Mafia is, well, since we don't have like fantasy dragons, but we do have Komodo dragons. There's frilled dragons. There's also a flying dragon, which they don't technically fly, but they glide, and they can glide very far. They're able to extend one of their ribs, creating almost like wings that they use to glide from tree to tree. So there are ways for us to sneak some dragon action into the zoo in Zoo Mafia and have some fun with it. But yeah, I love the idea of a Komodo dragon enforcer, or maybe a new boss, mob boss that's showing up that um wants to flex some muscle and take over the zoo. I mean, for one, Komodo dragons are absolute beasts of predators to begin with, and I think they would make a really cool NPC or villain, um, because where when you play the game of Zoo Mafia, for the most part, we really don't delve deeply into what special abilities you get from being an animal per se. It's kind of hand wavy, and
yep.
it's like, you know, you're a flying squirrel, you glide. You're a flamingo, you fly. You're a turtle, you can swim. If you're something with gills like a frog, you can breathe underwater.
You want to be a kangaroo or an otter, you've got a pocket that you can use, but it's not drastic. We're not creating a species, set of
Yeah.
moves or abilities.
Like,
It's hand wavy.
yeah, like if you're like, hey, I'm a creature that would normally have venom. What does that mean? I'm like, that means you can attack and do 1 point of damage like anybody else, but we're gonna say it's from the poison. But you can create special moves for your bosses that do incorporate some of these, like the
Yep.
bacteria of of a Komodo dragon's bite. Where if they bite you, the wound begins to fester, and you might need special care, and there might be consequences in the game until you get it taken care of. Right, like it could even be a side job that you have to do before you can even take on the main job of dealing with this new boss or this new enforcer, because maybe one of your buddies is rotting from the inside now because of the bite. So you have to go to the vet and get treated for it specially, and you know maybe the vet isn't automatically equipped for it, and you have to get special medicines or something, which means you have to pull a job outside the zoo and go rob a pharmacy or a pharmaceutical research facility or something in order to get what the vet needs in order to treat you. But the whole time you're dealing with this bite, and the worst part about it is that uh, that this particular villain would be able to track you for as long as you have this condition by smell, for miles away. So it creates some
That's
interesting opportunities.
it's just a fun way to incorporate these strange and bizarre animal facts into the game, if you so desire. Like, there's nothing that forces you to do it, but we're nerdarchy. We're nerds, and a lot of gamers out there follow that exact same thing. We enjoy learning these little facts and tidbits of this world. We've got a handful of videos where we talk about our D&D games inspired by real world things. So, like, there's nothing to say that you couldn't do the same thing with Zoo Mafia. You take these elements of what these animals can do in the real world and say, all right, how do I make mechanics for those type of things for the NPCs to make them more of a threat, to make them a different type of threat, something that isn't just as simple as oh, I need to do more damage.
Yeah, or the frill dragging, squirting blood out of its eyes at one of your mob members. Gross,
That
and
that
possibly something they weren't expecting.
Well, like, all right, what if you take uh what if you take it another step further? Like, you play a water dragon as a player, and every time you get startled, that's what you do.
But I would definitely,
Like,
but if a player did play a frill dragon or even a basilisk, I would definitely let them run across water.
that would be cool. It's like,
So,
your own personal Jesus.
so what's another idea, Ted?
All right. So what if we take the concept of dragon? So, riding dragons from the east, the rise of the Tong and the Yakuza signals a shift in the balance of power, as disciplined, bonded syndicates from the east bring a new era of calculated control. The Tong move like whispers through the dark, while the Yakuza strike with honor bound fury. Together, they ride the wings of change, challenging the chaotic dominance of the mammalian mobs.
So I like the idea of like maybe there's this Asian exhibit that is moving from zoo to zoo, but actually what it is either the yakuza or a tong, and they're kind of trying to muscle in on these other zoo turfs and take over. So what happens with your existing bosses, Al Capone, Machine Gun Otto, and Carlo Hambino? What do they do? Do they fight the tong or yakuza individually? Do they team up to try and fend off this outside rival? And now we've done different things. We've had a Russian mob show up in the zoo and kind of pass through, which was a little bit more cordial, but there was some conflict with that as well. But what about if it's actually a hostile takeover situation? And conceptually, I like the idea of, the dragons rising from the east to try and take over the zoo. It could be a fun arc. It could be a whole campaign, really.
I love the concept of, the traveling mafia, and maybe they're not so much as looking to take over, um but maybe that's their deal. They come in, they destabilize everything that's going on, try to acquire as much wealth as possible, in their limited time here. So it could be a thing of like, all right, well, do you glean this information? Do you try and find an information network from other zoos to find out, what happened in the past? So do you have to fight them off? Or, is literally just holding your own for this, shortened duration, whatever it is, um, you know, until the humans come in and move them off to another zoo. I like the possibility of playing, you know either side of that arc. You know, one playing it from the Yakuza side, or playing it from the zoo side, but playing it as, can you just batten down the hatches and survive, or do you have to hold your ground? Do you have to fight back? Like, there's so many different ways to kind of see how this all morphs and bends and twists.
Yeah, so definitely add some fun and interesting elements that you can kind of play with, and do some different takes on, or, our traditional Zoo Mafia game, which I always love to see how it works, and also maybe create some different interesting NPCs that uh you wouldn't normally have, that are influenced by different cultures than the criminal element that we're used to. So it would definitely be a little bit of a cultural exchange for our zoo, both in the underworld as well as the zoo exhibits as well. The dragons have awakened in the zoo. Komodos, frills, and syndicates from the east are making moves. What side will your animal take? Stand with the old mob families or ride the rising dragon tide? All right, guys, it is time where we take your questions, if you have any, in the chat. Our buddy Callie was in there, asked about the mini planes from Ulfgania, that where our dragons basically all got shunted off into their own. And yes, they all do have their own domains that they kind of rule over. And the way that we had two Dragonborn playing in our first Orthgania campaign that I ran, and they basically fell out of a magical anomaly, which was like um, a barred portal. Like, the portal was there, but they were able to go through it one time, and after that, nothing could pass through it. Eventually, the bar was removed, and they could, it became a permanent portal back and forth to the Dragon Realm, which is one of the first things that created this nexus point in in our main city of Griffingaff, that which really blew it up, was because it ended up having all these portals that were connected to it. We had the Clockwork Kingdom, we had the Dragon Realm. So they were able to actually import all these exotic goods and then distribute them through the world, and quickly expand it beyond what it initially started as.
And that adds a lot of depth to the world, to have you know a variety of cultures all funneled into one place. But the concept of these little, like, mini demi planes, it created another element of the barriers between worlds being so flimsy, that it created a number of story elements that could be played throughout multiple campaigns, because we've had multiple long running campaigns run out of Griffin Gaff, some simultaneously. So it was a lot of fun, to see and play, in all of these stories, and see how the ever changing aspect of the city being influenced by the games that the other DMs were running.
Yeah, definitely a good time. Volcanic Knight is going to steal some of your ideas for down the road with the Komodo Dragon. Tally also was expecting triads or tongues or yakuza or triads, and we're glad to not disappoint because that's where our brain went as well. Great minds think alike. Don't see anything else in the chat, so with that, and that's a wrap for tonight's journey through Dragonfire and Devastation. Thanks for flying with us.
Skybound beasts to psychic leviathans to crime lord drakes. We hope you found some inspiration to bring these titans to life in your own games.
Massive thanks to everyone who joined us live, tossed in questions, or just vibed with the conversation. You make this community legendary.
If you dug tonight's chat, hit like, subscribe, ring that notification bell so you never miss when we wake up another world-shaking idea.
So until next time, stay nerdy.
Stay nerdy.